I'm going to be discussing some research I did recently on who supports Donald Trump. I've been at Gallup now for 6 months. I was at the Brookings Institution for 7 years before that. And one of my first projects was to dive into Gallup's extensive polling data with a view, in this case, to analyzing those who have a favorable view of Donald Trump. Arguably, this would be of some interest for any presidential candidate. As you all know, Donald Trump stands out on a number of policies and positions relative to previous Republican candidates, relative to previous Republican presidents, notably on trade and immigration. He's far less open to increased trade and immigration than George W. Bush. John McCain worked while he was a senator to come up with an immigration deal that would have a net effect of making it easier for many people to immigrate here. Trump famously wants to build a wall. Arguably, he has adopted a nationalist position. And that makes him also somewhat unique relative to previous American leaders in the recent past. Puts him more aligned with someone like Jean-Marie Le Pen in France and some of the other nationalists in countries like Austria and Denmark, who have gained political momentum in recent years as those countries have dealt with controversies over migration policy and trade. In Trump's Republican National Convention speech, he of course essentially identified himself as a nationalist, arguing that he would put Americans first, and that's what distinguishes him in his mind from other candidates. So there's some literature on who supports nationalism in the academic scholarship. I tried to focus on pieces that had done some empirical analysis. The most famous nationalist party, arguably, is the Nazi Party in Germany, and analysis by Hamilton looking at essentially sort of district-level voting shares for the Nazi Party came away with some fairly interesting conclusions that it couldn't really be related strongly to economic position as measured by occupational status. Whether someone was Protestant or Catholic played a big role in whether they supported the Nazi Party, apparently, as Catholic areas were much less likely to support the Nazis. Whether someone lived in an urban or rural setting also apparently made a huge difference, with those living outside of the major cities much more likely to support the party. And it turns out that both low-income, working-class occupations and high-paying professional occupations were somewhat less likely to support the party than those in more middle occupations, small business owners, for example, or sort of lower-level administrative workers in professional settings. In a similar analysis in the U.S. context, looking at George Wallace's 1968 presidential campaign, arguably another nationalist candidate, Hamilton found that regional differences, not surprisingly, played a huge role. So those in the southern United States were far more likely to support Wallace, who took some very strong positions against civil rights. And there again, class was not particularly important in the North, but it did play a role in the South. In more recent work, Mansfield and Mutz analyzed people's self-reported views on nationalism and ethnocentrism, and found that these were more predictive in explaining views on trade and outsourcing than one's occupation or education, again, suggesting that there's more going on than simply one's position in the economy and how one's monetary circumstances would be affected by trade and outsourcing. Recently, the Brexit vote has drawn a lot of parallels with the Trump campaign, people interpreting that as something of an anti-globalization movement in Britain. And I haven't seen any micro-analysis of who voted for the Brexit campaign, but The Guardian did find that age, racial ethnic background mattered a great deal. Then more along the lines of the case that economic circumstances matter, David Autor of MIT and some colleagues recently published, I believe, a working paper at this point showing that political polarization is strongly correlated with exposure to Chinese import competition. And by political polarization, they mean the support of either extreme right or extreme left candidates, although not necessarily nationalist candidates by any means, but more candidates who were more consistently supportive of left-right positions on the extreme sides. And that was a county-level analysis or a congressional district analysis of based on the sorts of industries that are most exposed to Chinese imports, and that is measured by the change in imports from China over roughly 10, 15-year periods. So that would include computer electronics manufacturing, which has been by far the largest source of Chinese imports at the industry level. Also textiles, leather goods, the sort of components of the clothing industry. And finally, on the other side of this, a similar analysis from Chet et al. Found that trade exposure did not predict polarization, but rather just predicted support for the Democratic Party. And of course, the Democratic Party, for those of you who know U.S. politics well, has always been the party that's been more anti-trade than the Republicans, arguably up until this election. So that was consistent with what you might have expected. Then I've also looked at some literature on contact theory and from the social capital literature. Race has been, and race and sort of ethnic status, religious status have been big themes in this campaign, with Trump also saying he would not allow Muslims to enter the country and making statements that many viewed as derogatory about Hispanic immigrants. So there's a fair amount of literature on who holds more racially biased or racist views, and that literature is pretty clear that people who have greater contact with people from outside of their ethnic group are less likely to hold negative stereotypes or to exhibit prejudicial behavior in other respects. And there's also literature suggesting that they're less likely to hold nationalist views. Likewise, people who participate more in civil society through volunteer behavior or voting behavior are less likely to report holding nationalist political views. Of course, in both of these cases, it's not exactly clear which direction the causality runs. It may be that people who are more nationalists are drawn to participate more in society or seek out other people, or it could go the other way. In any case, for my analysis, I tried to consider all these possible causal channels for why somebody would support Donald Trump, and looking at the idea that social or economic hardship could be playing a big role. The logic is fairly straightforward there. If you're disaffected with the status quo because you've lost your job or your income is low, you may be more supportive of a more radical position, and Donald Trump is very clear that he's against the establishment, the party establishment, in the case of Republicans, and certainly the established political order as he sees it, controlled by Barack Obama. So that's something I'll be looking at in some detail. The second point is contact with immigrants or racial minorities. The third is direct exposure to globalization, which is similar to the economic hardship, but even, I think, important to isolate in and of itself, because Donald Trump has spoken so much about the importance of trade and its negative effects, as he's interpreted it from trading with China and Mexico in particular. And then I'm also going to look at some social capital indicators to see how that affects probability of supporting Trump. In terms of the data, I'm mostly drawing from Gallup data, which is available for purchase, I should say. It's proprietary, but it's anyone can buy it. Gallup has been interviewing, well, Gallup, I should say, interviews 1,000 Americans every day through its Gallup daily tracking survey. In 500 cases, it asks people political questions, and since July of 2015, it's been asking people whether they have a favorable view of Donald Trump and some of the other leading candidates. Compiling data from July of 2015 up until August 31st, I was able to get quite a large sample size of roughly 113,000 Americans who were asked whether they had a favorable view of Trump. Most of them, 106,000, answered the question, and 65% said no. In doing the analysis, I'm also bringing in external data sources from mostly publicly available sources such as the Census Bureau, the IRS, and other scholars like Raj Chetty. The regression model, for those of you who are into this sort of thing, is a probit regression, which basically predicts the probability of a binary outcome, a 0 to 1 outcome. And I'm controlling for a number of individual factors that are available directly from our survey, because we ask people about their education, their race, their religion, their age, many other things. And then I'm also bringing in geographic level variables measured at the zip code level. We know that because we know the zip code of respondents in some cases. Also at the county and commuting zone level, and a commuting zone is essentially a metropolitan area, a collection of one county if it's a small rural area, but for a place like Los Angeles, it would be not only Los Angeles County, but the counties from which people commute to Los Angeles with a great deal of frequency. So to go through the findings, and these are somewhat preliminary in terms of motivating the larger analysis. But first of all, I think it's important to establish that Donald Trump's supporters identify themselves as more ideologically conservative than the supporters than other Republicans who do not hold a favorable view of him, and certainly more than people who don't have a favorable view of him of any political party affiliation. The second point is that Donald Trump supporters are drawn from more of the middle income distribution. So this plots the probability of answering that you have a favorable view of Trump across income deciles. And what you can see is that at both the low income decile and the very top income decile, you see lower support for Trump, particularly at the lowest income deciles. And then you see it rise in sort of those middle income deciles, and that's also consistent if you look with the occupational distribution of who tends to support Trump. As I'll get to a bit in a minute, you see people from more blue-collar occupations are more likely to support Trump, which would include installation, maintenance, repair workers, construction workers, people in manufacturing, production occupations. And as I'll also point out, somewhat ironically, given his rhetoric, it's among blue-collar occupations, it's actually those that are least exposed to trade that are more likely to support Trump. So it's not the production workers. There's sort of a small correlation with Trump support, but it's greater with the construction, installation, maintenance, repair workers, who in very few cases are at risk of their job moving overseas. So this table here, and I apologize, there's a lot on this table. I'm going to try to rush through it with the highlights, but this is essentially pointing to which variables have the strongest predictive power of whether someone has a favorable view of Trump. And then I've divided or sort of segmented the different variables as a way to sort of line up with the different hypotheses that I'm interested in testing. So one I've just called identity culture, and there I'm grouping in your age, whether you're a man or woman, and older people, males, are far more likely to support Trump than younger people and females. Whites, not surprisingly, and especially white non-Hispanics, are far more likely to support Trump. Somewhat interestingly, veterans and those who have family members who are veterans are more likely to support Trump. And those who are Christian, but I should say not Mormon, are more likely to support Trump. Mormons are not particularly favorable on Trump. And Jews, Muslims are less favorable, and atheists as well. And when it comes to economic status, I'm looking at a variety of different measures. Education, as you might expect, predicts lower support for Trump, so people with graduate degrees are very unlikely to support Trump. Another measure of economic status that is not as readily obvious in that it's not a measure of income is someone's health status. I don't have direct measures of health in this survey, but I appended community level measures of health at both the zip code level and at the commuting zone level, and I found that white middle-aged mortality rates were significantly higher in the areas that are more supportive of Trump, or a respondent's probability of supporting Trump increases with the white middle-aged mortality of the area. And also found using zip code level census data that the neighborhoods measured by zip code that have higher percentages of disabled Americans, even adjusting for age, are more likely to support Trump. So that does indicate to me that lower health status is predictive of Trump support. And income actually goes the other way. The incomes of Trump supporters are slightly higher than those of people with otherwise similar characteristics. And that's not only an effect of the controlling for education. Like I pointed out earlier, they are often in sort of middle-paying occupations, and business. If you're a business owner, which we asked directly in the survey, you're more likely to support Trump. Getting closer to the core themes of, I think, why I was asked here. Those who live in areas that have more manufacturing jobs are less likely to support Trump, and exposure to Chinese trade competition does not increase support for Trump. Manufacturing growth does not have much an effect on whether someone supports Trump. I'll get into this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Also, I found that Trump supporters live further away from the Mexican border than non-supporters. So the way that I interpret this is, despite the rather urgent rhetoric on the importance of trade and building a wall with Mexico, it seems that his supporters are actually much less likely to be directly affected by either trade or competition with Mexican or other Latin American immigrants. And distance to Mexico is my preferred measure, but you can actually just look at percentage of the population that was born in Mexico or born in other Latin American countries, and you get a similar result. So I'm running out of time, but on the trade data, I just want to point out that it was such a surprising finding in some ways that I looked at many different robustness checks. So I measured trade in, I'll just skip to this slide. I'll measure trade in a variety of different ways, looking at previous growth in jobs, manufacturing jobs, looking at the share of jobs in manufacturing in someone's community in 2000, before China really had such a huge impact on the market. And then just using different data sources as well. There's, as I mentioned, David Autor and his colleagues have done a lot of work on coming up with ways to define exposure to the Chinese market, and using their indicators, I also find that exposure to China either reduces Trump support or has no effect. And so I'll stop there and look forward to discussing this more. Well, let me just give this very quick overview. There's strong evidence that non-economic characteristics matter in support for Trump and nationalists, and more generally. Mixed evidence for economic characteristics: poor health, I didn't mention it in detail, but lower social mobility from an intergenerational perspective is also correlated with lower Trump support. No evidence for the globalization hypothesis, strong evidence for contact theory, so Trump supporters are much more likely to live in racially isolated zip codes with few minorities. And there's also some evidence for social capital theory and that lower voter participation predicts Trump support. Thanks very much.